All right, we'll be in the book of 1 Kings this morning. We're doing, in case you're not aware, we're doing a Bible survey. We began it, shortly after the first of the year, I suppose. Anyway, taking one book a week throughout the entire Bible. Tall task in a lot of ways, and maybe we've left out some things you wanted to talk about, but we try to do this flyover look and tie all the pieces of the story together. One of the difficulties in taking a close, minute look at things is sometimes you lose sight of what God is doing overall. So that's our purpose, to look at these things together and just get an appreciation for God's grand plan of redemption from beginning to end. The Bible is a record of that story. God working over a great deal of time. It's not that maybe in the sense God couldn't have done it instantly if he'd have chosen to, but in God's will and purposes, this was something that was taking some time, and he's working it out perfectly. We can trust him for that. But as we've seen, there's been some pitfalls that have gone on with the story, and I guess that's because humankind's involved in all of this. I did want to make mention that these early books in the Old Testament are narrative in the sense that they kind of were tracking a story chronologically, really. Genesis through 1 Kings is kind of just follows the passage of time. So that's going to change in a little while when we get into the prophetic books, and we're going to be jumping back in the timeline to some things we probably talk about today. But for our purposes here in 1 Kings, we're still tracking the narrative of that story time-wise. The timeline for the events recorded in the book of 1 Kings would be roughly 970 to 853 BC. So we're getting closer to the time of Christ. Obviously, Abraham, perhaps 2,500 years before. You go back to Genesis chapter 12. The farther you go back in Scripture, the harder it is to put dates on things, but roughly in that time period. So we've advanced up to about 800 BC. Let me give you a short summary. We'll look at an outline in just a moment. If you've got a question or a comment, just hold up your hand and flag me down. 1 Kings records the transition between King David's reign and the reign of his son Solomon. All right, we've traced the story, the first king of the people of God, first earthly king. God's always been their king, if they would have acknowledged that, but they didn't. They wanted a king like the nations around them, so Saul was the first one. Then Saul gave way to David. We talked about him the last couple of weeks in 1 and 2 Samuel. Now we've moved to the transition between King David and Solomon. That happens in the first half or so of the book, and then the last half after Solomon, the kingdom's divided. And I guess, as we've traced this story, you could kind of see the train wreck coming, right? This experiment in kingship, if they would have just, accepted the fact that God was their king and they didn't need an earthly leader, probably could have avoided a lot of this, but be that as it may, the kingdom is ultimately divided. Solomon, of course, is known, if you study the Bible at all, you know that Solomon is known for his wisdom and wealth, and basically, one of those guys that had it all. You could literally say probably Solomon had it all in his day and time. He builds the magnificent temple of God in Jerusalem, but later, Solomon's life goes off the rails. I'm going to use a lot of train metaphors today, I guess, but Solomon's life goes off the rail. He multiplies for himself wives and concubines, and they tempt him to go into idolatry. This is the king of God's people, and that, of course, leads to God's judgment upon the nations, and the division of the kingdom is part of that. After Solomon's death, the kingdom splits into Israel and Judah. Up to this point, it's been one, if you could say, united group of people, known as Israel or primarily Israel. Now, in the north, you've got the kingdom of Israel. The Bible refers to it. The kingdom in the south, the kingdom of Judah, primarily The tribe of Judah and Benjamin, I believe, were the two primary ones there. The other 10 tribes or so were the northern kingdom. So God's people divided, almost like civil war in a lot of ways. The northern kingdom, of course, if you're familiar with Old Testament history, was plagued by evil kings. And we're going to get into some of that, as we mentioned today, the latter part of 1 Kings. But there was not a good king among the group. From beginning to end, the kings of the northern kingdom, starting with Jeroboam, one after another, was involved in sinful things. You've got the prophet Elijah, who primarily spent his time confronting the idolatry and the sin in the northern kingdom. Judah, of course, that kingdom in the south, struggles with faithfulness to God as well. There are a few good kings in the mix there as you trace the history out. But God remains working through Judah, because that's the line, of course, that the Messiah ultimately will come through. 1 Kings in general teaches that faithfulness to God brings blessings, but rebellion leads to downfall. And as I typed those words, I thought back to how many times have we said that in the story, right? It's really pretty simple. If you endeavor to be faithful to God, and that doesn't mean you never make a mistake, but if you endeavor to be faithful and do what God says, you know what? God's promised to bless that kind of life. Won't be perfect, but faithfulness brings blessings, but rebellion leads to downfall ultimately, right? No exceptions, right? You know, you read the wisdom literature, and we'll have a chance to get to that eventually, but a lot of the wisdom literature, you know, talks about, boy, it seems like the wicked have it made, right? Some of the Psalms cry out to God, boy, I'm faithful and I'm struggling, and it seems like the wicked have it made. But if you follow it out, wickedness always leads to negative things to come. All right, let's quickly go through a brief outline of the book. Again, if we could take time to go verse by verse and get it all done in one class, that'd be something. But let's just do this flyover look. The book kind of divides neatly into two halves. The first half, chapters 1 through 11, are what I'm going to call the glorification of the nation. And this is Solomon's story. Solomon is anointed as king in chapter 1 following the death of his father David. Solomon is appointed king there in chapter 2, and then Solomon is acknowledged to be God's chosen leader. And those first 3 chapters highlight the humble start that Solomon had, right? God, he's anointed as king, and God asks him for what would you like, Solomon? And of course, you know the story, right? Think about if you had, carte blanche. God, I'll give you whatever you want. Well, we might fall into the trap of maybe what Solomon was tempted to do. The Bible doesn't say he ever thought about anything else, but most people we know probably would say, well, you know what, I'd like $1 billion, or I'd like this or that, material things. Solomon says, you know what, and this is a very loose paraphrase, but you can read it later today if you like. Check that out. But Solomon says, who am I to lead the people of Israel? Give your servant an understanding heart. He asks for wisdom. God, being the benevolent God that he is, says, you bet. I'll give you wisdom, but I'm going to add to all those other things you could have asked for. And if you know the story of Solomon, I believe it's later the Queen of Sheba comes to visit him, and she's heard about this great Hebrew king, and but maybe she had her doubts, and she travels to see Solomon and his realm and his kingship, and she says, the half wasn't told to me. It's far beyond what I could have ever imagined. Solomon's wealth is described in chapters 4 through 10. He's got domestic prosperity. The wars that that the nation of Israel had been involved in. By Solomon's time, David had a great hand in subduing all the challenges to the nation, and Solomon was the beneficiary of that. He lived in a great peace. He had some religious accomplishments. Again, the building of the temple. David wanted to do it, but because he was a man of bloodshed, the Bible says, God says, I'm going to let your son take care of that. He also enjoyed political stability. So, wow, by the time you get to the end of chapter 10, this is the ideal situation. But, and that's a big three-letter word, you've got Solomon's wickedness. So you got wisdom, wealth, and wickedness in chapters 1 through 11. Chapter 11 is where you read of, I guess all the great things got to him, and he falls into idolatry and great wickedness. And that leads, as I said a while ago, in chapters 12 through 22 to the division of the nation. At this point, God is going to start to deal with all of this, and it's going to mean that the kingdom is going to be divided. You've got the revolt of the 10 northern tribes of Israel. As the story goes, Rehoboam was Solomon's son that became king, and he had a chance to unite things, but maybe last week we made reference to this idea, but Rehoboam, the advice of the older men was, you know what, you've got, again, loose paraphrase, you've got a great opportunity here, Rehoboam, to unite the people under you if you'll just ease up the burden. Great advice. But the text says Rehoboam listened to, his crowd, the younger fellas, maybe the ones he hung out with, and they had not better advice, but they had different advice. Oh, he says, just make it harder. They'll respect you. Well, that drives the division there. And then you've got the trouble. Jeroboam, God appoints him to be the leader that would come and lead the northern tribes. So things are a mess. Then starting in chapter 17, you've got the stories that include Elijah. Elijah, the great prophet of God. One of the most foremost prophets in the Old Testament. In fact, Elijah, we learn later in the New Testament of the two people that appeared with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. You've got Moses and Elijah, and if you will, symbolic of both their spheres of influence. Moses and the law, and Elijah kind of the pinnacle of the prophets. So, a very important figure at this point in Israel's history. You've got a famine in chapter 17, and then you've got the great battle between Elijah and the false prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, or Carmel, chapter 18. Elijah calling down fire from heaven and consuming the sacrifice and the altar itself. And then you've got the trouble that comes to Elijah because of that. The king, of course, in the northern kingdom of Israel was Ahab, and he had a wife named who? Jezebel, right? It's a name over the centuries has been associated with great evil. Not many people name their daughters Jezebel for a reason, right? I'm trying to remember if I've ever encountered someone named Jezebel in my life. There probably have been, but anyway, side note there. Jezebel tries to wreak havoc after that event, and there's this battle between Elijah and Ahab and Jezebel. The last 2 or 3 chapters talk about the reign of King Ahab, and he sets in motion a lot of other evil that he passes on to his generations. And no good comes from that. But that's a rough outline there. Any questions or comments? I guess I've been doing all the talking up to this point, but anything to add to that? There you go. Thank you. Elijah's the one, the story of the fiery chariot that takes him to heaven. There you go. So will be introduced eventually in chapter 2 Kings to his protege Elisha. But yeah, Elijah and Enoch were the two translated to heaven without dying. Thanks for reminding me of that. Something else? Well, at the end, when we try to show how the New Testament kind of brings in and reinforces the story, Elijah's mentioned a few times later. Each week I try to give you what I believe to be the theme of the entire book, try to bring it down into one word or a phrase. I believe in 1 Kings, I had the failure of a kingdom, and that was Saul's story. And then 2 Samuel, did I say 1 King? 1 Samuel. 2 Samuel, I believe it was something like, I don't remember my own stuff, but I think it was the establishment of a kingdom. And that was David's story. And sadly, we've got to pick as a theme, no, we don't have to, but I have, the division of the kingdom, and that's Solomon's sad part of all of this. In 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 18, and this is after Solomon, but there's a phrase in the book of 1 Kings that kind of summarizes this story or theme of division. You've got this battle between King Ahab and Elijah the prophet, the king going head-to-head with God's spokesman and back and forth in a power struggle in a lot of ways. Ahab doesn't care for Elijah, and there's a reason for that. Elijah, as the prophet of God, was calling him out and his regime for their sin. As the story goes, I believe at some point Elijah comes and Ahab says something like, "Is it you, O troubler of Israel?" That's a classic, be a classic movie line. But is it you who's causing all this trouble? See, in Ahab's mind, Elijah was the troublemaker. And notice Elijah's response, 1 Kings 18:18. He said, or Elijah said, "I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house have, because you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord, and you have followed the Baals," or Baals, however you like to say that. Prophetic word from God there, and maybe Elijah kind of setting the mold for all of this. You got later prophets. Well, I guess an earlier prophet would have been Nathan with David, right? Nathan, if you will, got in King David's face about his sin, right? And didn't shy away from it. That's the nature of a prophet of God, especially in the Old Testament. Here, Elijah is doing the same thing. You are the troubler of Israel. You're the reason for all of this. It's hard to say words like that to somebody with this kind of authority, but Elijah wasn't afraid of that. Kind of to break down this theme, the division of the kingdom, we learn a couple lessons overall, really. There's more, but we'll talk about some more lessons in a moment. But we learn in 1 Kings that division is avoided through faithfulness. We talked about that. We see it in Solomon's life. Early on, he was faithful, and God blessed him richly, but that changed. Jeroboam, the one who God appointed as the king after the division of the kingdoms in the north, he served faithfully for a while, and things went well. So division is avoided through faithfulness, but division is also accomplished through sin, and that's highlighted in Solomon's life, his son Rehoboam, and even Jeroboam as well. So again, you've got this dichotomy. It's really pretty simple, right? Faithfulness or wickedness. We have a choice. These kings had a choice. So let's talk about some lessons then. Some things may come to your mind as we go along, and my list isn't exhaustive, but I think it's good to, these things, at least to me, jump out of the book of 1 Kings. We've got a story in chapter 1 right away, and David, by the way, is dying at the start of 1 Kings. He's old, or he's advanced in age, and David had his own problems, right, due to his sin. His household was a mess, and Prophet Nathan said that's the way it's going to be. But you get to chapter 1, verses 5 and 6, you've got this power struggle. The king on the throne is ready to die, and David, and when you have several wives and kids by all those different wives, then you got the intrigue starting. Who's going to take the throne? Well, you've got one of David's sons named Adonijah, verse 5 of chapter 1. Now Adonijah the son of Haggith, one of David's wives, exalted himself, saying, I will be king. So he prepared for himself chariots and horsemen with 50 men to run before him. Verse 6 says, his father, that's David, had never crossed him at any time by asking, why have you done so? And of course, this is on the heels of, we read the story, and God has already chosen Solomon's going to be the one. But anyway, this Adonijah is going to be him. David had never crossed him at any time. He was also a handsome man. He was born after Absalom. Anyway, as the story goes on, he's not going to be the king, but those words jump out at me as far as, especially as, you think about as parents and fathers. There comes time in children's lives where they have to be crossed, don't they? I've never seen an example where children left to raise themselves ever turns out very well. Have you? Because what happens? You can raise a little tyrant if you let them have their own way all the time. I'm not saying you've got to rule with an iron fist or a club. That's not parenting. That's right. Exactly. The time comes, though, when you got to say no. Cross that little one. Do it in a godly way, obviously. But failure to cross our children when they need it can lead to problems later. There's a whole lot more we could say about that, but in general, that's the principle, isn't it? Yep. Okay. So, yeah. And that's the balance that every parent tries to get in life, and that's right. Amen to that. Amen to that. All right, so that might be one lesson you could take from this story. Another lesson that we learn in going through the book of 1 Kings is that we don't serve a located God. That's come up in, I believe it was 1 Samuel. But notice what happens in 1 Kings chapter 8 and verse 27. Periodically, the people of Israel seemed to think they could put God in a box and kind of use him as their magic rabbit's foot, as we might say. 1 Kings 8, here you've got the ark of God being brought into the temple that Solomon had built. Anyway, you get down to verse 27 of chapter 8. And here, this is Solomon's prayer of dedication. The great expense has been, no expense was spared in building this grand temple in Jerusalem. It was a beautiful thing, been one of the 7 wonders of the world, even from a secular view of things. Beautiful thing. Solomon is praying to God to dedicate this temple to his service. And start in verse 26. Now therefore, O God of Israel, let your word, I pray, be confirmed, which you have spoken to your servant, my father David. Solomon says in verse 27, but will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you, how much less this house which I have built. So, again, Solomon had head on straight at this point. He says, yeah, this is a grand place, Lord, but it isn't like we can confine you to this magnificent temple. In fact, later in, is it in Mars Hill in Athens in Acts 17 where Paul talks about, heaven and earth, I just lost the words. What does he say there? How does he put it? Verse 24 of Acts 17.
The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives life and breath to all things and all people.
So Paul is making it clear there, just the same thing Solomon is saying here, that you can't put God in your box and expect that to go well. And we need to keep that in mind. We don't serve a located God. Yes, God, that was the dwelling place of God and under the old covenant in that sense, but yet God wasn't bound to that. So, does that make sense? All right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's right. All right. Another lesson to consider. We're going to run out of time here. That's my fault. Corruption in the nation often comes from within, and that's Solomon's story, right? The division of the kingdom of Israel wasn't caused by the external threats of the day, and Israel had their enemies, but over and over again the Bible shows that usually the problem starts within, right? And that story is told here. Another lesson, it's unwise to refuse to listen to the advice of those with more experience. That's chapter 12. We talked about that. Rehoboam could choose between the advice of the elders, the older men, and the advice of the younger men. It's not to say that younger men never have any good advice. They can. But you ought to pay special attention to somebody who's been down the road a while, right? That's the role of older people in the faith, is to help to be guides. Doesn't mean older folks are perfect. I can affirm that. But hopefully they've got some wisdom of years that helps them see things that maybe the younger set hasn't learned yet or hasn't seen. But it's always unwise to at least discount the advice of seniors without even thinking about it. You can learn from the book of 1 Kings that you can't straddle the fence religiously. And that brings to mind Elijah's story on Mount Carmel, right? He reaches a point in that battle between the 450 prophets of Baal and the lone prophet of God. Elijah confronts the people of Israel and basically says, what? You need to make a choice here. Chapter 18 and verse 21. Love the words. Sounds a lot like Joshua in about chapter 21 when we look at that. 1 Kings 18, verse 21, start in verse 20. So Ahab sent a message among all the sons of Israel and brought the prophets together at Mount Carmel, or Carmel. Elijah came near to all the people of Israel and said, how long will you hesitate between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, follow him. But the people did not answer him a word. By the time the dust settled that day in the battle of the prophets, the people said, we'll serve God, we'll serve God. The point was made, but in effect Elijah's saying, you just can't, you need to pick a side here, folks. You know, it's kind of modern day wisdom to try to see, give value to every idea out there, every truth, but there are things you got to choose on. Again, Joshua says much the same thing in his book, but sometimes people need to make that choice. An old preacher one time, I wish I could remember how he said it, but the only thing you get by straddling the fence is splinters. Well, you can think that through if you like, but anyway. Another lesson, God doesn't always work in flashy ways. That's the aftermath of the battle on Mount Carmel. Elijah wins this great battle, but it doesn't seem to make a lot of difference. He goes off by himself and kind of has a pity party. You know what? He says, I'm the only guy left, God. You just as well take my life. And there's that scene on the mountain there where, earthquakes and rocks and mountains falling. And the God was where? in the small, still voice. So God doesn't always work in flashy ways like the mountaintop battle, but God is still there. So you don't always have to see the flash to know. And then finally, we learn that envy is a deadly sin, chapter 21, and you can trace that story out later today. It's always been that way and always will be. Jezebel and, of course, Ahab wanting Naboth's vineyard, and they basically just took it, and that didn't end well for the king. Something before we look at the ties to the New Testament, anything at all. Okay. Yeah. And just off the top of my head, and so don't take this to the bank, because, but my guess is what Jesus is saying there, or whoever's speaking there in John 3 would be thinking of going to heaven for a certain purpose like Jesus did. There might be a difference between that and the others that, the Bible seems to pretty clearly say we're taken there. So, yeah, beyond that, I'd have to do some more thinking. But sometimes it's just a matter of the perspective of the one speaking. All right, a couple of things. I guess our time is up, but the book of 1 Kings looks ahead to the Messiah, not in some specific prophecies of the coming Messiah, but the New Testament writers and authors looked back at this book and affirmed it as a historical event. You've got in Luke chapter 1, you've got the angel appearing to Zacharias, John the immerser's father, and speaking about this coming one who will be, Luke chapter 1, verse 17, it is he, speaking of the young child that Zacharias and his wife Elizabeth will have, is he who will go as a forerunner before him in the spirit and power of Elijah. So there will be a coming prophet like Elijah. And Jesus refers to this as well. John is that one. He wasn't a reincarnation of Elijah, but he dressed like Elijah. He had a message much like Elijah. He had a job to do, and John did that well. So again, looking back to this part of the Old Testament, in chapter... Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. 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 Both in their way, pointing ahead to something or someone greater. In Matthew chapter 12, verse 42, Jesus says this, the queen of the south will rise up with this generation at the judgment and will condemn it because she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, something greater than Solomon is here. That was the part of the Old Testament I referenced earlier. So, again, a look back at 1 Kings. And then finally, that Mount of Transfiguration story, Matthew chapter 17, verses 1 through 3. Moses and Elijah appear talking with Jesus. Jesus talking literally about his own exodus. Scholars refer to the story of Jesus as the second exodus, the greater exodus, prefigured by the first one. But Moses and Elijah appear there in Matthew 17. So, again, so just some links between the old part of the story and the new part. And anyway, time to stop, past time to stop. So you're welcome. Take some time if you can to read the story of 2 Kings rather.